Good afternoon. Welcome to the Council on Foreign Relations. My name is Romesh Ratnazar from the U.S. Department of State, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel with this extraordinary group of people on the 25th anniversary of German unification. This is part of a series sponsored by David Rubenstein on lessons from history. The Council plans to have many more of these events in the coming years in both New York and Washington, D.C., so we're very pleased to be part of that series. A few items of business before we begin. This meeting is on the record, and we will have a short discussion between the four of us about some of the lessons and legacies of unification, and then we will turn it over to questions from all of you. I will briefly introduce the speakers here with us, but I think all of you have their introductions in front of you, so I don't want to go into great detail. But briefly, Mary Elise Cerati is Dean's Professor of History at the University of Southern California. She's also Research Associate at the Center for European Studies at Harvard, and she's the author of The Collapse, The Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall, which is a terrific read and a great ground-level book and study of the causes of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Peter Wittig is the ambassador to the United States from the Federal Republic of Germany. He was previously the German ambassador to the United Nations, and we're obviously pleased to have him and his experience here to contribute to this conversation. And of course, Robert Zoellick is the chairman of Goldman Sachs' International Advisors. He was previously, as you all know, the president of the World Bank, and perhaps most relevant for this conversation, he was the lead negotiator in the 2+4 process for Germany's reunification, working under Secretary of State James Baker and President Bush. So I wanted to just open this conversation by talking a little bit about the kind of prevailing historical narrative and historical understanding, at least here in the United States and elsewhere, about the causes of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the unification of Germany, the peaceful resolution of the Cold War. And I think to some extent we tend to look at these events through the prism of political leaders, Reagan and Gorbachev, Thatcher, Kohl, and Bush. Mary, I wanted to ask you, as a historian who studied this period extensively, is that the right prism through which to understand the events 1989, 1990, 1991, and to what extent were those events driven by decisions taken from the top, and to what extent were they driven by forces from below?
Great. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the Council. It's an honor to be on a panel of this caliber. Thank you to all of you for coming. An event as important as the end of the Cold War, the unification of Germany, obviously has multiple causes. And one of the ways that I discuss with my students, some of whom are here in the room today, I'm glad to see them, is as a process of revolution from above and revolution from below. And without both of those revolutions, you don't have the end of the division of Germany. So obviously, you need to understand the changes instituted by Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, by President Ronald Reagan, his rhetorical power, as you've described in your book, but also the effects of the protest movement from below. Of course, Solidarity is a very important protest movement, but within East Germany as well, East German dissidents, the Protestant churches, some of the Catholic churches inside East Germany also nurtured a wave of protest movement. And the East German regime, which wanted to be a hardline regime, was unable to maintain control in the face of these two different revolutions. And for me, in a sense, the end of the division of Germany is the moment when those lines cross. The East German regime is losing its ability to maintain control, and the power of the peaceful revolution is rising. And when the peaceful revolution eclipses the East German regime, that's when the wall comes down, and that's when the unification of Germany suddenly becomes a realistic possibility if diplomats can pull it off peacefully and successfully. And I know, of course, that Ambassador Zellick was one of the crucial players in accomplishing that momentous outcome.
Well, one of the things that you explore in the book is just how contingent this whole event was, that there was not a great deal of anticipation that things would move as quickly as they did.
Yes, the East German regime, in some ways there are some parallels to the North Korean regime today. It was trying to hold out despite pressure to reform from a big brother. And the East German regime was not interested in opening the Berlin Wall. And indeed, one of the surprises of my research was that it was planning a Tiananmen-style event in Leipzig in October 1989. So there were a number of dangerous moments. I was actually just a teenage exchange student in Berlin in 1989, actually in West Berlin in 1989, which is how I got interested in this in the first place, by having been there and witnessed so many events. And at the time, it of course felt like an enormous party. But now as a historian researching that again, I became retroactively scared, because it seemed like there were actually a number of moments where it could have turned violent. And there were a number of lucky breaks that resulted in a peaceful outcome to the upheaval of 1989. But that was not a given. As we saw in China in June 1989, violence was a real possibility.
That's a good segue into my next question, which I wanted to ask you, Ambassador. Again, we tend to think about the East German dynamic and the revolution spreading across Eastern Europe. What was the attitude of West Germans toward their brethren in the East, but also toward this whole question of unification and what the burdens would be for West Germany if that were to come about?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, and thank you to the Council for commemorating 25 years of German unity. I did it in my way in the residence a couple of weeks ago with 3,000 Washingtonians, which was a great party, and we had Joachim Gauck, our federal president, as a guest, who was an agent of that peaceful revolution at the time. But before I come to your question, let me just preface that with a remark on American statecraft, because this is an American audience, and I think it needs to be said from a German. I think the way things unfolded in 89, 90 was probably one of the finest moments of American statecraft in the 20th century. The US, the administration, and many people were more clairvoyant than many Europeans about the way things would unfold. The US administration at the time had a strategic vision. They knew that this freedom movement was unstoppable, so the challenge was to embrace it and steer it in the right direction. And they did an excellent job in sort of management of change and in sort of warming up friends, allies, but also adversaries to this momentous change that happened. And Bob will probably like that when I say this was not only great statecraft, but also great diplomatic craftsmanship. Now, to your question, I think, again, many Americans were more clairvoyant on the unification of Germany, on the emerging revolution, than the Germans themselves. If you would have asked people in the summer of '89, when will Germany reunify, you wouldn't have heard many positive answers. Honecker, a couple of weeks or months before, the head of the number one East German ruler said, this war will stand for another 50 years and maybe 100 years. So that was a strong statement, but somehow shared also by many West Germans, even as first signs appeared. So I remember Vernon Walters, the ambassador at the time, had said, I will witness the fall of the wall during my tenure here. And he said this 2 years before the wall came down, and nobody really believed him in Germany. So don't underestimate the surprise that we ourselves felt when things unfolded that dramatically. I think there were some ideas in the West, mainly by intellectuals, of a kind of a third way, now that the wall had fallen, that there was a prospect of unification, some intellectual proposed that we should have a confederation and somehow be a third entity between East and West. But that was not embraced by the people. I think the West Germans were in a way dumbfounded by events, but then they embraced it joyfully, but they wanted basically to take in East Germany into the Western fold. And this is how it worked out. And I think this was basically a recipe for success, not to go a third way, but firmly embed the new Germany in the European Union and in NATO. That's what most of the Germans felt the right way to do, and I think there we coincided with that American strategic vision.
Well, Bob Zoellick, you may want to just take a victory lap after those comments, but seriously, I would like you to walk us through the kind of thinking inside the Bush administration as it was witnessing these events of 1989 into 1990, and to what extent were you guided by a strategic framework, and to what extent did you have to sort of adapt as events carried things in a direction that you might not have anticipated?
Well, first, let me join my colleagues in thanking CFR for doing this. Almost 20 years ago, I had suggested to CFR that it build a historical sort of set of events like this, including some diplomatic historians and others that look at these issues. So I'm really glad that David Rubenstein has supported this. Let me suggest three thoughts that kind of build off what others have said. First, Mary Elise's point about revolutions from below and above is a very interesting one. But then to combine it, I guess, with the diplomatic sense, we've had a lot of history of revolutions, French, Russian, Middle East. And I think she's correct. You needed the below and above, but you also needed something that then structured it. So, one of the revolutions that worked successfully was the US, and that probably required the Constitutional Convention and others to shame it. So it's interesting as students think about this, you've got the trend lines, but then kind of what's the effect of human endeavor in diplomacy? And that's also very important because on the structure, while it's natural that people talk about Germany, and my German colleagues would be the first to acknowledge this point, the real question was the unification of Europe. And so this was not just a German issue. This was dealing with anxieties in France and Britain. This was dealing with Poland. This was dealing with the rest of Central and Eastern Europe, the Baltics. So the architecture and strategy had to be one that was European-wide and transatlantic. Second point relates to, in a sense, what Ambassador Wittig has mentioned, and you asked, how is the administration looking at this? It's very hard for government officials to predict specific events, as we know from 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or others. Lots of research done in the intelligence community. I do believe it's possible to anticipate directions and trends and to try to prepare for them. I think in probabilities a little bit, so it's kind of how you can, it won't always come to pass. But so the world that President Bush 41 and Secretary Baker saw in January '89 was one where you clearly had a Gorbachev phenomenon that was creating ideas of political liberty in Central and Eastern Europe. The Germans were sort of particularly enhanced, sort of great hopes. And part of the job was sort of how do you respond and position to that? So Ambassador Wittig mentioned Vernon Walters. What's interesting is, President Bush in May of '89 gives an interview where he says we're comfortable with the idea of, we then called it German reunification as opposed to unification because of the 37 borders. And this is a very shocking event to people, but it was part of an idea of signaling kind of the U.S. willingness. What's been lost in a lot of the historical treatises, and I think very important, that same month there was a NATO summit. And Bush comes up, if you go back in the Reagan period, you have a lot of nuclear arms reductions and discussion. That was the arms control agenda. He totally shifts it to conventional forces. He comes out with a very bold initiative that talks about reducing and equalizing forces. So bold that his chairman of the Joint Chiefs resisted it, later opposed him because of it. But the idea was multiple. Number one, if we could start to send the signal that Soviet troops might lead, how would that leave Europe how would that sort of fit sort of the political climate? It was very important with the Germans because after the INF treaty negotiations, the 00, the intermediate range, the only nuclear weapons left were the short-range missiles. And as the German defense minister said, the shorter the missiles, the deader the Germans. So there was a big debate about modernization of the short-range forces, which we could kind of put aside because the focus had been conventional. If the conventional succeeded, you wouldn't need them to the same degree. Third, it establishes Bush clearly as the leader of the alliance. Margaret Thatcher wasn't so keen on these ideas. Bush sort of pushes it through. So then he goes to Eastern Europe, he goes to Poland and Hungary. So quite interestingly, by the start of the fall of '89, he's already positioned himself as alliance leader, bold moves, arms control issues. And while you couldn't predict, he was quite well aware that this was also a response to what would be the yearnings of the German people. And that goes to the third point that both of them mentioned in your question is, what is interesting, as Mary Elise talks about, is kind of how this was driven by the German public. But then there's a couple interesting diplomatic dimensions of that. One, which Ambassador Wittig talks about, Baker goes to the Nikolai Kirche in Potsdam in December of '89, almost a month after the wall went down. And one of the things we did is we visited some of the very courageous Lutheran ministers, the lay people, and others. And even as they are saying they would like to create a third way, Die Dritte Weg in Germany, they're honestly admitting that's not what their parishioners want. Their parishioners want what they see on West German TV. This is a bit of a diplomatic light going off for us because what we realize is that this is not going to be a merger, it's going to be a takeover. This has implications for the constitutional basis using Article 23, which would have been designed for the Saarland as opposed to a merger. But there's another implication, which is that this is now a force. It's a diplomatic force that you can use, but also can hurt you. You can use it in the sense is that, look, frankly, other Europeans and the Soviets, yes, Gorbachev unleashed this. Gorbachev was not there trying to drive German unification for it. But what could happen is you could make the point to the Soviets, this is an unstoppable force. We run into dangers, as Mary Elise mentioned, of all sorts. We have to kind of steer and direct this.
Yep.
But then the other side of it was, of course, the fact that for the U.S., which had some objectives like unified Germany and NATO, we had to do this in a way where we didn't turn German public opinion against us. So what's intriguing in this whole story, even the announcement of the 2+4, which is in early '90, I felt was important because you were going to have the elections in March of 1990 in the Eastern Länder. And frankly, these people never had fair elections. So the rest of us believed that they'd vote what they wanted, but who knows? And I think the announcement of the 2+4 signaled that this is for real. The four powers are going to move forward on this. So I think part of it, anticipation, structuring it, but also the key role of Germans east and west as a force in determining the nature of this.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the personalities of the leaders who were very much at the heart of the drama. So maybe we just start with President Bush. He famously said when the wall came down, he didn't want to dance on the Berlin Wall. He was famously stoic when asked about it in the Oval Office. But he did move very aggressively on unification and said something to the effect that he didn't want the Russians to claim snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. And he pushed very hard on unification. What do you make of that? I mean, to some extent, the gap between his sort of public reticence and then his private determination and assertiveness to reach the outcome that we did.
Yeah, good question. And your question might have been even either intentional or accidental. You posed the not dancing on the wall versus but was your conjunction that you used. They weren't a but, they were an and, okay? Because the key point was to be able to work with Gorbachev and the Soviet Union, he did not want to be seen as dancing on the wall. As you suggest, this cost him politically. There were a lot of your former colleagues in the journalist profession that hammered him on this, but he was quite resilient and committed to the idea that he knew he was going to have to work the diplomacy with Gorbachev. He was trying to build trust with Gorbachev. Remember, he had seen Gorbachev before he became president up in New York, and he'd seen him as vice president, but he didn't have a meeting as president until December in Malta. So he's going to see Gorbachev shortly thereafterwards, and that meeting in Malta becomes very important in framing Gorbachev's perception about the United States as kind of working with him with what he was trying to do in the Soviet Union, but also framing the relationships with Germany, because at that moment, Gorbachev and the Kohl relationship was a little fractious. But to take another example, to give a sense of President Bush's attitude, it's revealed in this interview that he gives in May, where again, in sort of very general language, he says, look, you know, after 40 years, you got to let a guy get up. They've earned their place. So it's very general language, but what it would communicated was, we trust German democracy. Germany's an ally. Germany's a partner and a friend. And while that may, unfortunately, that was the view of much of the American public. It wasn't the view of some of the elite opinion here, if you go back to the editorials, but it was the American public. And that actually gave us additional sort of freedom in the process. I think beyond that, what is important is his relationship with Kohl and Baker's relationship with Genscher, and together their relationship with Shevardnadze and Gorbachev is absolutely critical. There's a trust, there's a sharing of information. Some of this has been discussed in some of the books. But to give a little sort of anecdote that will drive this home perhaps, Genscher actually goes to Shevardnadze and tells a joke, since we got the East German connection, that's going around Germany about a meeting of Gorbachev, Ronald Reagan, and Ernst Honecker, the head of the East German. And they're all summoned to heaven. And God says, look, I got some good news and some bad news. He said, you know, good news is, you know, or he says, I want to let all of you know as leaders that the world's going to end tomorrow, and you can do whatever you want. So Reagan goes back on American TV and says, you know, I got good news and bad news. Good news is God does exist. There's been a question. Bad news, world ends tomorrow, okay? So Gorbachev goes on TV and says, I've got two pieces of very bad news. That God we didn't believe in, I'm afraid he does exist. And number two, the world ends tomorrow. And Ernst Honecker gets on and says, two excellent pieces of news. He said, first, you know, that question about East German recognition, it cannot be a question. I was brought up to heaven with two other guys. You know, God believes in East Germany. He said, second, he said that perestroika and stuff we were worried about, tomorrow it's over. but the key point is, Shevardnadze likes this joke so much, he says, I got to call Gorbachev. And so he calls Gorbachev and relays the joke. So that's a special relationship.
You should have told me that when you gave me interviews for my book. I would have.
I got to save some.
That's right. You got to save your best material. Ambassador, let's just quickly talk about Chancellor Kohl, who, again, not a obviously charismatic individual, but someone who had a deep feeling for the people, I think. What was his special role in bringing about the peaceful unification of the two Germanys? And then I think before we open it up to questions, I wonder if you can reflect a little bit about the evolution of Germany's role, both in Europe and the world, as it is now at the forefront of another major global story. And what, if anything, can Germany call upon from its experience to deal with the challenge presented by this refugee crisis?
Well, Helmut Kohl was the right man for this historical moment. He sees this moment, and I think he was more clairvoyant about the way this could unfold than many of his compatriots. He had been on a nosedive in his poll ratings before, and he emerged as the leader of Germany after those 2 years. He had always held a belief that one day German unification, reunification would happen. He just had not believed that it would happen so soon, but he had clung to this belief, and he had, I think, a great feel for moods of the people. So he realized also very early in the day that the East Germans wanted a quick economic union with West Germany. So they wanted the Deutschmark. They wanted to have the same standard of living. And, you know, instead of engaging in all kinds of scenarios of a third way. He quickly went to facilitate a free and fair election in East Germany, and there you could see the East Germans voted for the way that then German unification happened. They voted for the Deutschmark, if you put it in a nutshell. So he was validated by this first free election in East Germany, and then he just sensed that there was a brief window of opportunity, that events were in flux, that this configuration of leaders was fortunate, great friendship with President Bush, a relation of trust with Gorbachev, but he knew, and of course, a more skeptical relationship to Margaret Thatcher, and a friendship with Mitterrand, but a skeptical Mitterrand. So, and he knew that it was probably a small window of opportunity. So he accelerated events. And I think that, makes him a great statesman to have taken the right decisions at this critical moment. Now, your question, how this role of Germany after unification evolved. I think Germany got, as the American historians Fritz Stern has said, got its second chance. And the question was, when the track was somehow foreshadowed and Germany was on that track of a unified country, could we earn the trust of our European neighbors? Because that's worthwhile to recall, there was a lot of skepticism and a lot of distrust. Is Germany just too big in this centric geographical position in Europe, just too big? Will it derange and destabilize Europe? Will it erode the balance of power, this equilibrium? Very much the Thatcher thinking that was widespread. So I think what this government and then ensuing governments try to do is establish Germany as a trustworthy partner. And I think we did it, with important decisions like recognizing the German-Polish border as eternal, but also being a promoter of European integration. And this was important. The euro was a project to gain trust. We tied our economic future to a European currency. It was a political project. Not many people understood it at the time, or didn't even at the euro crisis in the US understood. This was a political project. So we would do anything to salvage this political project. And I think we also were rightfully restrained in our sort of military and international role, because there you could have aroused some skepticism. So over time, that evolved. Don't forget, we were called the sick man of Europe at the end of the 90s, because we had to tackle this huge economic challenge to integrate the morose East European economy into the whole of Europe. So the sick man of Europe, the economists called us. Now in 2013, the economists called us the hegemon of Europe, the reluctant hegemon of Europe. Now, we're not a hegemon, and we don't want to be a hegemon, but there is apparently a rise of European leadership, driven by events. And the latest event, and then I stop, is probably the year 2014, when Russia jeopardized the fundamentals of the post-Cold War order and annexed the Crimea. And all of a sudden, we were propelled into that leadership role, the chancellor, and she assumed it. And then the Euro crisis with Greece was also a moment where Germany had no choice but to lead. So it was an evolution, I think, of a rather subdued leadership role because of our size in the 90s and the first decade of this century to a not expected, not aspired to, not sought leadership role that we have to, like it or not, exercise right now.
Yeah.
Could I just, a real quick follow-up on this? Because again, you've got a lot of people in this audience who served in Germany and probably knew Kohl. It was interesting when you said you didn't see him as a charismatic figure. This is a person who could certainly fill a room, physically as well as literally. And I was reflecting on your choice of words on that, just because I do think there was a combination he had that maybe is important in thinking about democratic leaders in the future. On the one hand, and Ambassador Wittig knows this, he was a master party leader. He would know the birthdays, the holidays, the anniversaries of all the CDU leaders, had a real Fingerspitzengefühl, fingertip feel for the politics. But then he had this other quality, and some of my associates here are tired of having me reference this in other contexts. He drew this phrase from Bismarck: as the sign of a statesman is someone who recognizes fate as she rushes past and grabs onto the hem of her cloak. And it's a little bit, and with Helmut Kohl, when he grabbed on the hem, he could swing it a bit. So it's a little bit of this anticipation, but it's also seizing the moment in advance and kind of driving it forward. So in his own way, I actually felt he was a charismatic leader, but maybe in a different way. And then the second real quick point, when we talked about the strategic context at the unification for the US and its relationship to today, look, part of the judgment for the US was Germany's going to become the most important country in Europe. Now, we had our own treaty obligations, we had our own sort of sense of shared interest in German democracy and freedom, but there was also an interest calculation that we wanted to stand by Germany at this critical moment because we felt Germany would be an important partner in the future. And indeed, on this trip in May, Bush gives this speech in Mainz called Partners in Leadership. And anytime you use leadership in Germany, people get a little sensitive. But the key notion was we want to build a special link. And I think this is interesting because for reasons on both sides and events, I think this is kind of, we've lost sight of it and we've taken each other for granted. And exactly as you were starting to ask Ambassador Wittig, if you think about major issues in Europe today, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, whether it's refugees, whether it's the Eurozone, it would behoove the United States, I think, to have a deeper type of partnership with Germany. And that means working through some of these issues like the intelligence and the spying and others that have undermined some of the basic trust in the relationship.
Just to echo Ambassador Zelik's excellent points, my understanding of Kohl, of course, is as a historian through the documents produced at the time. And there he very much does emerge as a charismatic actor driving events. And actually, one of the treats for me this year was when the Foreign Office in Berlin, the Auswärtige Amt, released a wonderful new collection of documents and published them as well. I recommend this to you if you're interested in this. And this collection of documents included, among other things, information on the fact that Kohl had more challenges in his own coalition than we'd previously understood, that there was deep-seated tension between Kohl and Genscher about the shape, in particular, of European security after the wall came down. Clearly, something had to happen, but what? And I am just reading through these documents as quickly as I can. There are a lot of them, but it seems very clear that Genscher was trying very hard to promote a vision of European security based on the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE, the precursor to today's OSCE, and based on a concept of pan-Europeanism. And that did not sit with Kohl's emerging vision, which was much more based on the transatlantic partnership and much more based on NATO. And this tension resulted in Kohl not bringing Genscher with him to the Camp David meeting in February at the end of 1990, which caused a huge protocol problem since Secretary of State James Baker was scheduled to be there. And it was very difficult to have him there if the German peer is not coming. So this is a really interesting twist now in the story that we're just coming to understand. This story is, of course, by no means over. And it's thanks to your Foreign Office that these documents are now available and we can look at that. And that I mention that because it also has a connection to more recent events. which is that sometimes for a charismatic German chancellor or German leader, sometimes the biggest critics can be within the coalition or even within the union. What we're seeing recently now is the very sharp criticism of Horst Seehofer in the CSU against what Angela Merkel is doing as leader of the Union, whereas she has relative support from the political left. So I think as a historian, it shows these new sources tell me don't take for granted that coalition partners agree on everything, and we see that reflected in what's in the headlines today about the refugee crisis.
And just one little addition for the diplomatic lesson here. The fact that there were tensions between Genscher and Kohl was apparent on the U.S. side, but there's also a political reason, and Americans often miss this because we don't have coalition systems, is that, you know, if Genscher is going to distinguish the Free Democrats from the CDU, he can't just be the junior brother of Kohl, right? And some of the Free Democratic foreign ministers that followed him, this is one of their challenges if you're going to have a party. So if you want to understand a coalition system, you need to know that's going to happen. But we had a very close relationship with Genscher and his people from the State Department. The NSC and the president obviously worked very closely with Kohl and Horst Teltschik. And I don't want to overstate it, and obviously most of the time the NSC and State Department were actually on this quite well linked, is that sometimes we could kind of help balance the intra-coalition or the intra-coalition conflict in Germany.
Well, let's open it up to questions. Please wait for the microphone, be brief, and state your name and affiliation when called upon. I saw a hand there in the back. Let's start.
Thank you. My name is Sonia Schott. I am with Diario Las Americas, a Hispanic newspaper. My question is, what are the lessons to be learned from the past? Since there is too much talk right now in Washington about U.S. trying to recover the leadership in the world. So what is the U.S. expect from Germany? Facing all these challenges in the world like China and Russia, and what is Germany willing to play with the U.S.? Thank you.
Ambassador, do you
Well, maybe I focus on the German side of the equation. I would say that yes, the U.S. expects a certain leadership role of us in Europe. And I think by now we are ready to assume that leadership role. As I said before, it was not a leadership role that we strategically aspired to. We were rather propelled into that role by events, by our economic prowess, and basically by the configuration, the political configurations as they unfolded in Europe. I think it's not an easy debate within Germany about participating in international, in particular, military operations when you talk about assuming greater responsibility in international affairs. That is a legacy that a baggage that we carry from our history. We are sort of very restrained in terms of military interventions. This has evolved slowly but steadily into a more extensive role in international military operations. The latest probably threshold that we crossed was an active participation in the fight against ISIL by sending arms and equipment and training soldiers into a hot war zone in northern Iraq. We've never done that before, and it shows a new level of sort of international engagement. So there is an expectation clearly of the US that we assume an enhanced role in international conflicts and crises, a certain reluctance from the German population to live up to this expectation, and some constitutional restraints. We have a parliamentary army. Every single soldier that we expedite beyond the NATO area has to have a mandate by the parliament. So that's also a lesson of history, strict parliamentary control of the military. So in a case we are, in a sense, we are still a specific case in Europe in our military restraint. But there is no alternative. When we look at the crises right now, the root cause of this refugee crisis, which is really probably presenting the most serious challenge to Europe since its inception, is Syria. And also there, we need to be part of that coalition of countries that tries hard and probably with a lot of stamina that it needs to come to a settlement in Syria.
Could I take a quick cut at this?
Sure. Actually, let's take one more question, and then we can see whether there's some overlap.
Thank you. Hope Harrison, George Washington University, also a historian. So a question for Mary. You talked about the revolution from above and below, and I don't know if you have this experience also in Berlin, but a lot of my friends now in Berlin are talking about wanting to study more the side of history of the East German elite letting go. I mean, so many studies have now focused on the peaceful revolution and what the people have done. But there's increasingly a sense that, it took two. Just as the people were getting more power, people in the elite were increasingly willing to give it up. And I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Well, did you want to make
Go
your
ahead.
comment?
Go ahead.
Well, actually, just to, on the previous question, what does Germany want from the U.S., what does the U.S. want from Germany, I just wanted to add one sentence to Ambassador Wittig's excellent comments. It's my understanding from friends who have dealings with the National Security Council, and I believe there's at least one member of the National Security Council here today, so correct me if I'm wrong, that
Please identify yourself.
that the NSC staffers now routinely ask the question, what will Berlin think? And that question is now common. It was not a few years ago, but now in the wake of what's going on in Ukraine, in the wake of 2014, which I think in hindsight will look like a very, very important year in post-Cold War history, the role of Berlin is rising in importance. So whatever the answers to those questions, what the U.S. wants from Germany or Germany wants from the U.S., it's clear that there is a dialogue going on. It's kind of strange for me. It seems like, as someone who's gone back and forth between Germany practically my whole adult life, there seem to be sort of three levels. There's a kind of popular level, which is, I find, shaped by an uncomfortable level of anti-Americanism, a lot of protests now, particularly against TTIP. So there's a sort of popular discourse that has at least an anti-American cast rhetorically. Then there's a level of sort of people who are not really interested in foreign policy at all, kind of a general public. So the first group are people who are writing and publishing. The second group is more the general public. But then there's a third level, which is the governmental level. And I have the impression that the governmental level relations are excellent. John Kerry worked closely with the German foreign minister in Iran. The relations are as good as they've been in years. The relations are really, really good at the government level. But it's interesting because that isn't percolating through to the general popular level or to the journalistic level. So those are just a few thoughts on the U.S.-German. Just briefly on this point, which obviously is of concern, yes, I mean, I think that's why I like to talk about from above and below, right? As a historian, the only phenomenon I have never seen in history is monocausality. Important events happen for more than one reason. And that's why it's important to understand both the elite level politics and how a regime lets go or how diplomats respond to crucial events, but also the broader processes from the bottom up. So I think that you're absolutely right, and we can talk more about the details of that, but I think you're absolutely right, that's an important component.
Go to the middle of the room. I'm right here. The gentleman here in the, yeah, sorry. We come to you.
Sorry, Steve Flanagan from RAND. On the theme of letting go, one topic that hasn't been addressed yet is the Soviet calculus in all of this. Several of the panelists alluded to the importance of the relationships that existed with Gorbachev and the other leaders, with Shevardnadze and his counterparts, and but yet the Russians had the Soviets had an enormous amount of leverage at the time, still having 300,000 troops occupying Berlin. What is it? What do you look at in looking at the historical record, Professor Surratt, but also the two, and Bob Dalik as a practitioner? What is it that sort of led the Soviet leadership to finally give it up and recognize that they might face a fairly bloody alternative if they didn't, and the pressure that was alluded to that they put on Honecker to not have that crackdown in Dresden or Leipzig?
Well, look, this is where seeing it in a larger context, as you know well, Steve, from your work, there's actually a little parallel here with China. Gorbachev wanted to transform the Communist Party. He felt it was totally ossified, and it wouldn't lead the changes that he needed to have in the Soviet Union. The contrast, by the way, as Xi noticed, is also trying to transform the Communist Party, but he's trying to do it from the inside, and actually showed a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union to all the Chinese cadres saying, look at what Gorbachev did and how he screwed it up. So we'll see how that one plays out a little bit too. But then secondly, so his way of trying to reform the system, which he knew this is where the multiple causes. Partly the dual track, the strong nature of the NATO alliance. I'm talking about the dual track decision in terms of missiles and negotiation. Partly economics. You know, $15 a barrel or $10 a barrel oil, as Gaidar's memoirs demonstrate, was a very powerful effect on the Soviet Union. And we could discuss a little bit analogies to today's circumstance, although there are distinguishing characteristics. And so Gorbachev was very intent on trying to leverage the West. So he didn't want to create a conflict. And I think as an individual, this was tested a little bit in the Baltics in 1990, but I think he actually did want to move away from the hard-handed sort of Soviet sort of clampdown. And so his relationships with the United States and Germany become very important. Now, you're exactly right. They had 380,000 troops. They had 4 power rights. There's lots of different things that they could have relied on. And in the diplomacy, by the way, this is one of the things that led to one of the few internal disagreements in the US government at the time when we created the 2+4. Some people thought, oh, if we create the 2+4 process, that will give the Soviets kind of a mechanism to stop this. By the way, German public being an ongoing force, which also had to affect Gorbachev's calculation. I and others believed, look, you know, they've got different ways that they could influence things. We got to give them kind of a process. We'll use the underlying force of German people to keep sort of moving it forward, and you partly have to give them an explanation. So Mary knows this and others here. There was a point where we had been proposing a number of things to meet Soviet concerns. They hadn't registered, and we simply framed them as 9 points as a way of trying to kind of address Soviet concerns. So I think it was a combination of fundamentals in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev's kind of own personality, the fact that Kohl and Shevardnadze and Baker and others were trying to reach out to him. There's an interesting moment. We talked about France, which has now come out in the MEMCONs. This is early in the process, but Mitterrand meets Gorbachev and is basically testing the idea of, look, can we in Britain and the Soviet Union basically stop this thing? And in the memo, in the MEMCON, it's quite fascinating. Gorbachev reacts very negatively because he thinks the French and British are trying to set him up. And he basically, you could see what's going on in his mind is, look, if I have to choose who my friends are, I'm going to choose Germany and the United States. And I'm not going to be the fall guy for this process. So undoubtedly, this was his own view about the transformation of the Soviet Union and relations in the West. My own perspective, and I think this has probably been borne out by history, for Gorbachev, this was a very undefined set of views. When you go look at Glasnost and Perestroika, he's making it up as he goes. He had a sense of trend and direction, and then partly events sort of drove this. And one reason why, while I know in Germany Gorbachev is a great hero and he deserves credit for some of these things, I pause a little bit to say, look, I don't think that the Soviets woke up in '89 and said, oh, let's unify Germany and create European freedom. This is where the events on the ground drove it, and this is where, frankly, the diplomacy pushed him through. And one last point on that is that, you know, the ambassador mentioned this. Keep in mind, you know, the wall opens in November. The September of the following year, you've got the 2+4 agreement, unification in October. In August of that same year, you've got the invasion of Kuwait. So, my problem is my bosses are getting dragged off to do sort of other things. We never knew how long this would last. We never knew how long the window would be open. By December, Shevardnadze resigns. By next year, you've got a coup, okay? And Elisa's comments on this are rather, I think, striking. With hindsight, you have this 20/20 vision of how all this kind of worked automatically. I was fearful every day that there could be some incident with Soviet troops, some Stasi person would decide, I want to create a crisis. That was a constant anxiety in the process, as well as the anxiety that if the Soviets had had greater balance, if they wanted to really muck it up, here's a proposal. What if they said, okay, it's a huge concession. We'll allow Germany and NATO, but on the French model, not in the integrated military command. We couldn't have accepted that. And yet, my guess is the German public would have said, well, wait a minute, this seems good enough to us, given Soviet concessions. So there are lots of diplomatic steps where, frankly, this is where the US and Germany work as closely as I've ever seen in their relationships. We were constantly kind of using the momentum of events, but also trying to give the Soviets explanation while, frankly, dealing with our allies and calming them down, too.
Just to actually,
Why don't we take one more, because I think we're almost out.
Just very briefly, to echo what you said, it's important to remember Gorbachev did not wake up in 1989, exactly as Master said, and said, I'm going to give up East Germany. No Soviet leader would do that. East Germany was purchased with the blood of millions of Soviet citizens and soldiers in World War II. The Soviet leadership, including Gorbachev, saw the Soviet occupation of East Germany as wholly legitimate. The reason he suddenly had to think about giving it up was because the wall came down, which was a colossal accident. The causes that produced the actual opening of the wall were trivial, but its consequences were not. Suddenly, thinking about giving up East Germany had to be on Gorbachev's agenda, and then there were all these contingent factors at play.
Madam, you were waiting there.
Avis Bolin, retired State Department official. I have a question, but I just want to say, first of all, that I was a minor official in the European Bureau when all these events were going on, and mainly involved in the arms control. And I think I have never been prouder of American diplomacy at that moment. It was really just fantastic to
You're understating your role as a minor official, but gracious of you.
Anyway, I just wanted to add my words to the tribute. My question is about the unanticipated consequences of unification. And first of all, the integration of Eastern Germany into the West. As Bob said earlier, it was a takeover. It wasn't really an integration. And I think it turned out to be much more difficult than had been anticipated, and I would appreciate the ambassador's comments on that. And from an American point of view, Bob, did we overestimate how German gratitude for our support and diplomacy was going to play out in the immediate aftermath in Germany's relations with other countries, notably France?
Well, the unanticipated consequences. Maybe the Germans, the West Germans, had underestimated the dismal state of economic affairs in East Germany, and they didn't realize how costly it would be, that unification, that quick unification, quick economic unification of the basis of the Deutschmark. And I think it dawned on them that it was really quite a costly affair. Now, I think if the Germans had knew that, they wouldn't probably not have rescinded their enthusiasm, but it would have gone maybe a little bit of a different way. Second thing, we probably in the West, and I'm a Wessie, and I sort of looked at this from a Western perspective, we thought that we could sort of mentality-wise, mindset-wise, be more unified in a very brief time span that we actually did. I mean, there were still some walls in our minds and in our worldviews, even 20 or 25 years afterwards. So the unification on a human level in many respects went well, but there are still differences that remain. One of the sort of upshots of that difficult human unification was that you had a post-communist left party, the PDS, it's now called Die Linke, which really, in a way, was a novel element in the political landscape. You had sort of a party that at the beginning clinged to sort of the old East German model of doing business. So that was something new, and that was introduced into the unified political system of Germany, and somehow changed also the party system. So I would say it played out differently than Germany anticipated. But in hindsight, I would call this one of the huge success stories of Europe, a well-designed and well-rolled out unification. And let's not forget, this was the nucleus of bringing into the European fold all the East European countries. The enlargement of the European Union, the enlargement of NATO by the East European neighbors is a huge peace project, probably the best peace project in centuries in Europe. Countries that had been at war before several times, all of a sudden being part of that one European Union. That's a sea change in history, and that was partly made possible by this German unification. And last sentence, we are now going through a very, very difficult phase in the European Union, where this spirit of being one, the spirit of European solidarity, of the European spirit, is putting to a very tough test, to a litmus test, if you will, by the refugee crisis. And we're worried right now in Europe that there will be cracks in that, not only institutional, but also in that mental architecture. And we're going through a very decisive, key moment for the future of the European Union.
So just a quick thought on your first point, Avis. I remember thinking at the time that this was going to take much longer than people had hoped. It's natural in the process. An added complexity was you had 40 years of German social democracy, social market economy, with various regulations that then got imposed on the East. I remember talking to the new minister president of Brandenburg and saying, if you could experiment with some of the things that are now being discussed in Europe about structural reforms, less regulation, it will work better, but it is inevitable you're going to have the same system. But third on that, I hope you have this opportunity, which I've had, which is now and then I get a chance to meet some younger East Germans that are now in the professional sphere, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. I met the finance ministry, the foreign ministry, and it will warm your heart about the result that you achieved and the difference that it made for people. On the idea of kind of U.S. gratitude, you're an experienced diplomat. As you know, if you're basing your policy expectations on people having gratitude, you're probably on the wrong path. Nevertheless, I'm sure there's always a sense of that. But I'll come back a little bit to the other question I wanted to answer, because I'll connect it in this way. The United States, as you and probably most of the people in this room know, works best when it works with alliances and partners. And that doesn't mean, as the newspaper suggests, we get to order people around or direct or so on and so forth. You actually kind of have to understand them. And the ambassador gave a good explanation of some of the limitations in the process. So I think part of the effectiveness with Germany is understanding the strengths and weaknesses, just as we have strengths and weaknesses. So one of the points I mentioned is, Germany is dominant in Europe today, but it doesn't want to be seen as dominating. And you could hear the ambassador talk about that with hegemon. So actually, there's a role for the United States that can be a companion. Also, of course, Germany is respectful of European institutions. So you're not just doing it bilaterally with Germany. You have to do it in the overall structures. I have a little, this comes back to your point about gratitude. in the German official community, I find actually there is a gratitude. In the public, there's a little bit of the anti-Americanism that Mary Elise mentioned. But here, if we want to be smart, so let's take TTIP, which she alluded to. We need to understand how that is being perceived in Germany now and kind of how they see it as removing regulations and standards. And the framework and formulation of this, if it's going to be successful, will have to be different. I mentioned the spine as another sort of example that I think American public officials kind of underappreciated the sensitivity of this cost. But let me take one more small example that really drives it home. Look, there have been differences on the US and German side about sort of stimulation policies, okay? And frankly, I used to cringe when I'd see the US government saying, oh, Germans should spend more and so on and so forth. I mean, okay, there's a debate in the United States about Keynesianism, but in Germany, this is like spitting in the wind, okay? But could you go to Germans and say, you know what, you're not investing enough, okay, first in the public side or infrastructure, or maybe your business sector, if you look at the investment numbers, is slipping, so maybe you could use some depreciation, rapid depreciation treatment, investment tax credits. You can have discussions with the German Finance Ministry on that, and by the way, that's a form of stimulus. So the point of this, going back to the leadership question, is whether it's Germany or somebody else, to be effective, we kind of have to know where we can sort of understand their limitations, their strengths, and work with them to our sort of mutual end.
Well, we could continue this conversation for another 25 years, but we are already over time. I want to thank our speakers, and please join me in thanking them for this very illuminating conversation.
And we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.